Friday Transportation Seminar. I'm Kelly Clifton, faculty in civil engineering. This week we are pleased to have one of our PhD students in urban studies and planning, Tara Goddard. Tara has a master's degree in civil engineering from UC Davis, and she also has experience working for the city of Davis as their bicycle and pedestrian coordinator. So today she's going to talk about biking and walking. Are they cool? How do adolescents feel about these things? So I'm very excited to hear what she has to say.
Thanks. Thank you, Kelly. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I know it's a holiday weekend, so I appreciate you kicking off your holiday with me. And I'm also going to apologize in advance. I have a cold, and so I'm a little under the weather, and I didn't want to take too much cold medicine, otherwise I'd accidentally give an entirely different talk altogether. So bear with me. So as Kelly said, I'm a PhD student in urban studies and planning. I'm wrapping up my second year, and I'm going to be talking about the family activity study today. So just really quickly, I want to acknowledge the team. So Dr. Jennifer Dill is the PI on the project, and then I'd say the two primary researchers are Joe Broach, who's with us today and who's talked at this seminar about his part of the project, and Nathan McNeil, and then more PSU students actually than I'll ever even meet who've done work like a lot of the data collection and data entry, and so they've been invaluable on the project, and I don't even get to know their names, but thank you to them. The project, like I mentioned, is the Family Activity Study, so I'm going to be talking about that a little bit more, and it's funded by Active Living Research, which is part of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and I was able to present some of this research this year, as well as Joe and a few of the others on the team at the Active Living Research Conference in San Diego, which was really fun. Okay, so the Family Activity Study, if you're not familiar, it's a pretty unique and big project here at Portland State. It's a multi-year longitudinal study. It's an intervention study. So what that means is there's, as you can see on the map, this is the layout of Portland. If you're somewhat familiar, I got a pointer here. So this is the Willamette and the Columbia, and then this red area is downtown. And then the blue sites are our treatment sites, and the green sites are control. So there's 9 treatment and 10 control sites. And the sites were chosen, they're corridors that were slated for installations of bike boulevards, or what are now being called neighborhood greenways. So those are low stress, low volume bikeways. They get things like, turn stop signs, some traffic calming, neighborhood greening. So, really attractive ways to get around by bike, and it improves the walking environment as well around town. So that's the intervention that we're talking about. We do data collection before these bike boulevards installed, and then now the data collection's been going on since the bike boulevards or neighborhood greenways have been installed in those communities. So here's just a few pictures of different sites around. As you saw on the map, it's not just kind of the inner part of town. It's spread out around Portland, at least east of the river. So various things, like I mentioned, there's shared lane markings, the Sharrow markings, there's speed humps, ped refuges, and enhanced crossings where the greenways cross like major streets, the specialized pedestrian crossings here. This one on the bottom right is kind of just a cool neighborhood enhancement of the intersection, paint on the intersection, really cool place to walk and just be. So a variety of areas around Portland, but again, all these kind of low stress, low volume things. So keep that in mind as we're talking about this. So the piece I'm going to be talking about today is just on the surveys. So the project, we did survey research, then the families, so it's families that were contacted based on their location and they self-selected to participate. And the families, and so at least one parent in the household and then at least one child in the household wore GPS and accelerometer units. So then we have their actual behavior for how they're getting around, and that equipment can tell the difference between walking and bicycling and being in a car. And then so we have their self-report data through the surveys, the actual behavior, and then some of the objective land use data, like the amount of sidewalks in their neighborhood or what bike facilities are in their neighborhood and the traffic volumes on their streets. But just for today, I'm just going to be talking about the surveys. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about the adolescents, so the 11 to 16-year-olds. The kids, the younger and older kids, filled out slightly different surveys. As you can imagine, the younger kids filled out a simpler, shorter survey. But these guys had their very own survey. So there was a household survey that was done by the parents, or the parents in coordination with the kids. The parents filled out their own surveys, and then the kids filled out their own surveys. So we had 166 completed surveys from the adolescents, and then as you can see the breakup there on the boys and the girls. So not quite evenly split, but close. And the survey, one of the things that's really unique about it is that it asks a lot of attitudes and perception questions in addition to, how did you get around or how do you take certain trips. So there's, this is certainly a growing field of interest, but not a lot of people have done this yet. And as the psychological research tells us, attitudes are actually a very big predictor of people's behaviors. And then also we have questions about what's called perceived behavioral control and social norms. So perceived behavioral control, like, can I do it? Are things accessible? Will my parents let me do that? Because we have some questions about parental rules, and hopefully you got to see Joe's talk about that part of the work earlier this year, and if not, it's archived on the site for these talks. And then social norms, like, what are their friends doing? Do their friends think it's cool to do certain things? Are their friends actually participating in behaviors? And then we have some questions I won't be talking about too much today, but do their friends think they should bike more? Do their friends think they should walk more? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what my particular research questions were. First of all, again, not a lot of this has been done before, so a lot of this is just very exploratory. This is our first cut, and this is, I think I said, from just so it's cross-sectional data, so it's just the before surveys. So the after surveys are now coming in, and we'll be looking at that next, but this is just the before. So just kind of what are kids saying about bicycling and walking and physical activity, and then again, how do they perceive what their friends are doing, what their friends think about these activities, and then do those norms affect what kids say that they like to do? So does that have an influence? And then looking at the gender and age difference. And then after I did some of that exploration, I wanted to look a little bit deeper about this. We have separate questions on what we call active travel, so walking and bicycling for a purpose, to an activity, to a destination, versus exercise, which we ask separate questions about being active. And I'm going to talk about the specific questions in a minute. And then, so how do the kids rate their self-confidence? Like, are they good at something? Do they know how to do these things? Are they worried about being hurt? Are they embarrassed to be seen doing these things? Because, as I'm going to show you in a minute, that's quite common in the research, especially when you start talking about the gender gap, is fear of embarrassment and injury. Okay, so I guess I can back up and look at this. Some of the existing research probably won't be a surprise. Some of this is going to feel a little bit common sense, but research has shown that physical activity beliefs differ by gender. So boys and girls have different views about whether they like to be active, whether they feel like they can be active, if they're going to be good at it. Also, peer norms, as anyone who's been a teenager, as we all have, probably know that there's direct and indirect influences on what our friends are thinking, saying, and doing influences our own attitudes. Dr. Clifton, who's here, did a paper on teenagers back in 2003 and found that, a lot of trips are made with others. So not a lot of kids travel alone. So again, those peer influences and peer norms can really matter. And that when you look at the younger kids in particular, you see these gender differences. So the girls tend to travel less alone. So again, some of that's probably parental rules, like Joe talked about, or it could be other things like embarrassment and injury and competence. So again, this this gap, and I guess what I didn't do at the beginning of this talk, because I think you guys have seen enough talks, is talk about why this matters in the abstract. I mean, we know that childhood obesity is on the rise. We know that kids in particular, their lifestyles are becoming much more sedentary. That has problems, for both mental and physical health. And that in particular, there's a growing gap in boys and girls' activity. So girls' activity tends to take a real nosedive around the 8th grade age. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But that was most strongly predicted by this 2009 study by their perceptions about whether they were able to, again, coming back again and again to this embarrassment and ability. And then self-efficacy being like, can they do it? Can they execute this? Whether it's like, do I have the ability? Do I have these things accessible? Made the difference. So even when they perceive, like say someone perceived their environment was really walkable, but if they didn't believe they themselves can do it, then they didn't walk. And so that's why these self-perceptions can be really important. Okay, so some of the specific questions we asked, just so that you have an idea of what we were talking about, or how we phrased it, some of them are very basic, and AT being active travel, PA, I'll use it a few times as physical activity. So the questions being, some of the very basic questions. I like riding a bike. I like walking. And then we have more specific questions. I like riding a bike to school. I like riding a bike to parks and other places, and Joe talked a bit about park travel. And these are all on strongly disagree to strongly agree scales. And then exercise, like I mentioned, the exercise questions were asked separately. So I enjoy exercise. I'll be embarrassed if people see me exercise. I won't know how to do it the right way. I'm afraid of getting hurt. Then we have a lot of questions, which I didn't get into in this research, but you can guess there's probably some high correlations between. We have specific questions about, I don't like to get sweaty, I don't like to wear my helmet, things like that that you might anticipate that would affect how teens feel about some of this. And then we also asked questions, like I mentioned, about their friends' attitude and behaviors. So the ones that I've been looking at are other kids think it's cool. We actually use cool with quotation marks, which, we could have a discussion about how accurate that might be depending on the age. They might not think it's very cool that we said cool, but that was how we wanted to ask it. And then my friends bike a lot to get places, and so we have a couple different questions about, again, their friends' behavior. Okay, so we're going to get into the results. So is it cool? So on this question of other kids think it's cool, on again this strongly disagree to strongly agree scale, if you look, the boys, there was no significant difference on a boy who says, I like to ride a bike or I don't like to ride a bike, whether they reported that other kids think it's cool. So whether or not they like riding a bike, they reported about the same. And again, 1 being strongly disagree and 4 being strongly agree, you can see they roughly were in the towards the agreeing. Where you see the big difference is with the girls. So girls who don't like riding a bike also say that their friends don't think it's cool. So that's down there in the disagree that their friends think it's cool. But the girls who do like riding a bike are much more likely to respond that their friends think it's cool. So again, we talk about the importance of peer influences, and there's something at work here where it's affecting the young girls or the adolescent girls and not the boys. So we see a similar trend when we look at the behavior of their friends, that everybody doing it. So again, boys, even actually it's not statistically significant, but even slightly more responded that their friends bike a lot if they don't like riding a bike. But the difference was basically the same for boys who do and don't like riding bikes. Again, you see this big difference in the girls who like riding a bike and don't riding a bike, whether they're reporting that their friends are doing it. So you have this influence both of their friends' attitudes, they think it's cool, and their friends' actual behavior, what they're doing. So you might think about like peer modeling. So what are my friends doing? I want to do that. Okay, so moving on to some of these self-perception questions. And again, and I called it self-confidence. There's different things in the health literature, but it's related to self-efficacy, but it's kind of just a part of self-efficacy. But the self-confidence. And what you'll see, in general, when you first look at this, it's like, okay, boys and girls are both disagreeing. They're not too worried about getting hurt. But if you look more closely, girls are 2 to 1 more likely to report they're afraid of getting hurt when they're being physically active. And again, these are 11 to 16-year-olds, so you can think about that. And when you look a little bit deeper into that, you can see that it's not equally spread out, these percentages of like I feel yes or no, by age. It starts to matter when you look at the age differences. So when you plot this by age, the 12-year-old girls and boys are reporting about the same, like I disagree with getting hurt. But you hit the tweens, kind of this transition into the teen years, and all of a sudden you get this big split into where, again, so this dashed line is that I worry about hurting myself, and the solid line is I will not know how to exercise the right way. I don't know what I'm doing. And this trend continues as you did this. I just wanted to show you what it was for the tweens. So this really speaks to, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but if we start to think about what we're going to do about this, if the goal is to get kids more active and healthier and then form these habits that really affect adults later on, particularly in our country where we have a big gender gap in, say, bicycling among adults, then we can start thinking about, well, maybe we need to catch them before this split starts to happen. Okay, so self-consciousness, and this is my word for it. There's probably other words for it in the health literature, but I'll feel embarrassed. And this, again, we have this same kind of thing where you first glance at it and you think, yeah, there's, half of the girls totally disagree that, they're embarrassed to be seen exercising. But again, when you look at the ones who did agree, it's just over 2 to 1 of girls to boys, and it's statistically significant difference between the genders of being embarrassed. Okay, so this one, it's not quite as graphically exciting, but it's the same thing. You start seeing they're both pretty low, they both kind of disagree, but as the age happens, the boys start to increase, but they kind of start leveling off, and the girls really start spiking up in this idea of embarrassment. And I mean, this obviously has a lot of repercussions. Some of it, again, might seem obvious, but when you look at this, so when I actually correlated this embarrassment score with the I like riding a bike, you saw a pretty strong relationship where girls who are, embarrassed to be seen are much less likely to say they like riding a bike. And there was no statistically significant relationship for the boys. So there's definitely a strong influence in the behavior that this embarrassment factor is playing. And so one of the things, there are a couple of the questions that I had is, because you can look at it from, I'd say, a few different kind of causal directions. Do girls think of bicycling as like a non-trivial physical activity? Like, do they think of it as like, oh, it's going to be hard, it's going to be an effort, I'm going to sweat, whatever? Or you could also look at it the other direction. Do girls who like biking then have this body confidence where they're not afraid to be seen exercising? And whichever the directionality is, and I can't answer it with the analysis I did here, those are both important things to understand about what's going on. Okay, so some of the policy implications. Again, I didn't go too deeply into this because this is an initial cut, and this is definitely less my focus of the paper, but was, what does this kind of mean? So again, if some of our main influences on girls in particular choosing to bike, choosing to be active, can you do skills clinics that work specifically for girls? There's certainly clinics, there's bicycle rodeos at schools, there's different things going on, but do we need to be doing something different for girls and boys around this kind of like puberty age that addresses girls' concerns in particular? So again, this fear of injury and lack of skill could be directly, but then also through this indirectly combating this like fear of embarrassment type of self-consciousness that's also seems to be prohibiting the enjoyment of bicycling as a mode. And then also taking advantage of these peer influences. So whether that's organized groups, there's a really cool campaign in the UK called the Breeze Network, and it's focuses on adult women, but it's again doing these kind of social groups, these social rides, all abilities. So maybe looking at those kind of programs for girls and taking advantage of the fact that a lot of girls are more likely to report, kind of an influence of their peers. So can we leverage that to increase their enjoyment of bicycling as a transportation mode? And then again, as I showed in the age split, is this issue of needing to do it early enough. So if we want to really affect these attitudes, we need to do it early enough before you start getting that big split. And then otherwise you're kind of working backwards and you're trying to repair the split that's happened. So doing these things early enough where the boys and the girls at, say, 11 years old are still kind of feeling the same confidence, and I'm not afraid of getting hurt, and I like getting out there on a bike. So some of the next steps we have planned, like I mentioned, this is longitudinal. So we're getting in the data now. So not only can I talk about the age gap and the change in age for some of these attitudes among the sample, now I can look at these same individuals, these same teenage girls, a year to 2 years later and say, have their attitudes changed? So is it really an aging effect? Does it really have to do with something with the age, or was that just the sample? And then I didn't talk about it in this talk, is do these attitudes really play out in their behavior? So looking at their accelerometer and GPS data and seeing, if the girls aren't reporting they like bicycling, but they're doing it just as much, then that's less of a concern, or it's a different concern certainly from a behavior standpoint. And then, because it is an intervention study, we are doing these neighborhood greenway treatments. The big question is, do the girls and the adolescents in general in these areas with these new treatments, does that change? Does that influence their attitudes and then their behavior in bicycling and walking? So those are the big steps next that I will be doing, as well as some of the other researchers on this project. So I encourage you guys to keep your eyes open for that. It's going to be, it's going to be over the next 6 months to a year to 18 months. There's going to be a lot of cool stuff coming out on this project. And again, I finished a little early. Sorry about that, but I am happy to take questions. There's project information if you want to check out the entire project, or you can contact me. I'm happy to answer questions. And if you happen to be on Twitter, there's my Twitter handle. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Well, we have lots of time for questions, and as you were showing the graph about the split in embarrassment, I think, yeah. And so I'm wondering how this correlates with other kinds of study on gender in teens about science and math and girls' decline in interest. And is it that this is embarrassing, or is it that there's this idea that being physically active is a masculine activity, and similarly interest in science and math is people have this idea that it's masculine. And I just wonder if there would be an interesting thing to delve into that literature a little bit and see how they've made changes, what kinds of interventions have been done to increase the interest there.
That's a really good question. So one thing that's related to that is that I've been learning about is this idea of stereotype threat, it's called. So there's this, kind of pervasive cultural idea, what you're talking about, that girls aren't as good at science. And being aware of that stereotype kind of can stress girls out to the point that they then don't perform as well on, say, a science or a math test. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it would be very interesting to kind of explore whether that's going on here. So the embarrassment or even these fear of ability, is it really that girls, don't know what they're doing or are more likely to get hurt? Or can there be not only a role that they just think that, but then they actually are more uncertain or less certain and, have issues because of that stereotype threat. So it's a really, and that's, I think, a concept that hasn't been applied a lot to transportation. That'll be really interesting to pursue. I saw a study on novice drivers that where the women and novice drivers, there's this idea that like novice drivers are bad, right? You see the car with the driver in training and you want to stay far away from that. Well, that knowing that people are looking at you like that actually made them then perform worse in the driving test. So it's kind of a similar concept. Yeah.
So you looked at kids or adolescents' perceived attitudes about their peers, and I think their peers thought it was cool.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you looked or were planning on looking at correlations with their parents' attitudes and like what kids perceive their parents' attitudes to be about active travel. And I think maybe that would play slightly into like the rules too, like maybe
Right.
girls perceive, I don't know, something about like their parents' active travel based on like the rules that differ between them and their siblings of different genders.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have questions, I guess I didn't have them up here. We have questions about these kind of norms and rules from the parents, the siblings, and the friends. And that's actually another of the strengths of this study is that we had 490 kids and I think 323 households. So obviously if you do the math there, that's quite a few sibling relationships. So we can look at that. I haven't for this. But I know Joe, in the looking at the rulemaking and the parents' ideas and parents' beliefs, found a gender difference, I think, in particular to non-school travel. So thinking about like school travels, maybe a more regular trip, there's someone expecting your child on the other end, so you're less likely. But then you start seeing these rules come into play. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but these rules come into play for other trips like to the park where parents start enforcing these differences. So then you have this kind of cycle of, oh, a girl, my parent doesn't think I should. And we have specific questions about that, like my parents don't want me to do things, my parents don't think it's safe versus I think it's safe. And in some of the research that I've seen that other people have done, parents' rules were more, parents' beliefs were more restrictive than the kids, which is probably not surprising, So, but that's a good question. And so that's a big part. This is a massive data set, and so there's going to be a lot of different things. And when we get into further stages of actually doing some modeling, where this was just very exploratory. Yeah, thank you.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about your next steps, particularly about if you have any thoughts about how you're planning on conducting the facilities, what facilities may feel safer, or I think that was one of the questions that you had. I was curious how you were planning on doing that.
Well, so, that's, Joe's going to be able to answer this better than I am because that's less what I've been a part of. But so we'll know all the different treatments in the different neighborhoods. So in the models we can kind of control for, looking at attitudes and behaviors for everyone who's in an area with the same treatment. And so then you can start to look at, is the treatment itself and is a particular kind of treatment helping this? Again, with only 9 treatment areas, we don't have tons and tons of things where so we can make sure that it's not an effect of other effects going on, so that we can say it really is just the facility effect. But that's going to be what we're looking at is, so what kind of treatments they got in their area and how that changed. So we know, like I said, the objective land use data, so what was there before, what kind of, say, pedestrian facilities were there before, what kind of bike facilities, what kind of volumes, because we ask questions about, it's not safe for me to do this because there's too much traffic in my neighborhood, or drivers usually, I don't remember if it's usually obey the speed limit or speed, it's, which version of that, but we ask questions like that. So we'll be able to look at all those things and see, controlling for those factors, did their behavior change based on whether they live in an area that got a bicycle boulevard or not.
This actually feeds a lot into what Katie just asked. And I was curious if you saw differences geographically about people's reporting both safety and embarrassment numbers. And I guess before it hadn't, part of it will probably be when you look at what the treatments are in different geographic areas, but also I don't know if car ownership rates or socioeconomic statuses of different geographic areas would play into sort of these attitudes, and whether
Right.
you looked at that as well.
Right. So it's a great question. So, well, first of all, I should have said, or I could have said that the sample, it's a self-select sample. So, like I said, we contacted these people and they opted in, and it's non-trivial. They have to wear these units, they have to interact with us to get the units and drop them back off. And then there's the idea that they'll participate and then participate again. So you do get a self-selection bias, and the sample was definitely more white and higher income, and I think higher educated than like a general sample of Portland. So keeping that in mind. In this level of analysis, I did not look at that, and partly it's because if you go back to my sample, say when I started looking at just the girls, 75 girls spread over 19 neighborhoods, you start to get just really small, ends. You get a few girls here and a few girls here, and certainly by age, then you start, it just breaks down, and so it's hard to say anything statistically significant about that. But
And it seems like you don't have many that are 16, given your distribution. Many.
There's fewer 16-year-olds. We definitely had more in the middle-aged, or the middle ages. Sorry. In the 11, 12, 13. We get the sample gets smaller as we. I don't think I had that anywhere here, but yeah.
Well, on your data, it just sort of cut off.
Oh, that I did. That I did just because I wanted to share what was going on with the tweens, because it was kind of the most interesting.
Yeah.
I just shared I dropped the 11-year-olds and the 15, 16-year-olds. So.
Because I think in some of my work that's very dated now, one of the questions that came up was, as tweens are allowed a lot more independent mobility than the younger kids, right?
Yeah.
And so biking becomes a really cool thing, and riding the bus becomes a really cool thing if it gets you away from your parents faster, right? But then at that critical age when the driver's license becomes an option, suddenly the bus isn't as cool as it used to be.
Right.
And so I think that's a critical sort of time period to look at.
Yeah, I think you know, let's see, where was it? Here, you know, you get maybe some changes due to, like, you know, especially because some of these start to converge again in the older ages. So I think you get kind of a maturation or puberty effect where the girls hit it first and they start worrying about being sweaty and being embarrassed and body changes and things like that. And then the boys start to catch up as they do that. And then, yes, certainly as you hit the driver age. And I didn't look at it for this study, but we do have questions on kids' attitudes about driving. Will driving make me more independent? I think there's a question specifically that says, I can't wait to drive when I get my license or something like that. And then we have some questions about barriers to biking and walking that get at some of the things that, you know, cars can be better for. Like, I have too many places to go and I have too much to carry. So, but yeah, changing the culture of, even though, you know, there's a lot of studies been coming out about have we hit peak driving, and people in there, I forget what the age group, 20 to 29 is driving less, trending, but there's still very much a culture in our country of 16 license, and especially when you do have a sibling situation where the 16-year-old becomes the chauffeur for the household, you know, for their siblings. So.
Other questions? We have one on the web. Can you speak to the influence of the participants' parents regarding the adolescent's preference of physical activity? So it kind of seems like a future.
Yeah, that'll be again a future thing that I didn't really look at. Some of that, I think Joe looked more at the rules. I don't think he looked so much for the preferences for physical activity of the parents. Although I did find another study that found that the less active parents actually had more active kids. And I can't remember what they kind of speculated was the
Rebellion.
Rule. Oh, rebellion, I don't want to be like my parents, or maybe the parents kind of being like, I'm not as healthy as I should be, so I'm going to encourage my kid to be more healthy, or, you know, whatever it is. But that was kind of an interesting, you know, find that for younger kids it might be more similar to their parents. You get more of the parent, you model after your parents versus you get to that age.
I think it's a great thing to look at, especially here in Portland, where a lot of parents have been bicycling them,
Right.
taking them to school by bike for a long time, and so
Right.
is that like a near-death experience for them, you know,
Right.
so embarrassing, or is that something that they end up embracing?
And I feel like there was another speaker here recently that kind of they had that finding where they were less, or maybe this was at ALR, the kids were less positive about biking and walking if their parents made them do it.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like, you know.
Piano and
like, so if they
soccer.
But I mean, even among kids that did it the same amount, if they were forced, then that really made them negative about it, versus even though they were bicycling the same amount as the parents who let them do it. So.
Other questions? Lots of good stuff here.
You spoke a little bit about, you know, kind of interventions that are going to come out of this data. Are there specific examples of interventions targeted at girls in this age group? I know the Safe Routes to Schools, I haven't seen anything specifically for girls, but there may be.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd love to hear about it if people have heard of them. I was looking for that type of thing, and a lot of the interventions that I was able to find come from the health side of things, and they tend to be more about preventing negative behavior than promoting positive behavior. So smoking, cessation, things like that. But there was less so of promoting physical activity, and in particular what we're talking about, because it's kind of unique and it isn't addressed very much yet, is active travel. So this kind of incidental exercise where it's on the way to doing other things. So I can't, and I looked to see if I could find something kind of specifically targeted for girls, and I didn't. You know, like you said, Safe Routes has stuff kind of, but it just kind of puts all the kids together, and, you know, as I think we know from other things, that's not always the best way.
It also seems to me that if this sort of flies in the face of what the health people will probably say, but if one of the reasons that girls are resistant to it is because they see it as exercise, maybe we shouldn't call it active travel, and maybe we shouldn't talk about it in terms of exercise, and talk about it in terms of transportation. If there's an idea that, oh, this is going to make me sweaty, or I can't wear my street clothes.
Right. And I think it's a great point, and I think, too, just looking at the literature, I mean, and just knowing from American culture, for girls, there's a lot, not that there's not for boys, but for girls, there's more wrapped up in encouraging exercise. So it's like you need to be, it's not just you need to be healthy, it's you need to be thin, you need, and so there's a lot of kind of emotional baggage, I guess you could call it, wrapped up with encouraging exercising. But if we can not lump active travel with that and make it more about independence and being with friends and getting to cool activities, then maybe you can avoid some of that kind of the complications you get from the health promotion stuff. So it's a good point. I think there's a lot of room for research for anybody in the room who's interested in this.
This is more just another comment on the facilities. I was just thinking it would be interesting to control, again, future research, but perhaps control or compare Portland with another city that doesn't really have any type of bike infrastructure, and if that changes how, kind of that embarrassment level, because I know like where I grew up, like there really was no bike infrastructure at all.
Right.
And it just wasn't even like in the realm of possibility to bike to school.
Right.
So that would, I don't know, I just think that could potentially be interesting to see if that actually does change anything.
Definitely. And a lot of, so the embarrassment question comes from the section on exercise. So we can compare that to literature on, because that's, certainly asked, that type of question's been asked in all different kinds of communities. And, what's like, but you're right, it makes the point of like in places where that's just not even an option. It's not, I'm not embarrassed to do it, nobody does it, so what do you, that's, why would you do that? So I think, long term it'd be very interesting to see this type of intensive longitudinal process repeated in other places. Portland, obviously, it's, and one thing I really like about this study, I'll just go back to the map here, is you do have some communities where it's like, oh, it's Portland, it's the inner Northeast, it's, it's so different from everyone, which isn't, that true necessarily either. But then you have these neighborhoods out here, which, east of 205, it starts to look a lot more like, outer Sacramento or outer lots of towns. So it is kind of nice that we have these opportunities to look at these attitudes and beliefs and then the influence on behavior in communities that aren't necessarily part of the kind of like the Portland bike culture. So, anyone else?
I'm not letting you guys off the hook. So Tara, do you have questions for them? You're in the process of thinking about this. What are some sort of things that you'd like us to engage with for the next few minutes?
Well, yeah, sure, that's a good, so one thing I think that I didn't answer, but I kind of alluded to several times, is there's such an interest in getting adult women bicycling and closing the gender gap among adults. And so this question of, can we really just say, is that just a factor of, okay, well, we're finding these differences among adolescent girls. Is this where the gap is happening? Is it a totally different gap? Can we intervene and then, follow? One thing would be great is to then follow these women onward and see what other factors go into this. So that would be a question, I guess, for everyone.
Yeah, it looks like most of the people in here were teenagers more recently than I was. So anybody want to talk about your thoughts about cycling when you're a teenager? Give us food for thought.
I have a question. So have you looked at studies looking for differences in attitudes among teenagers in European cities where the gender gap is lower than in the U.S.?
Right.
Just to find if there are some kind of differences in behavior.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that's one of the biggest kind of next steps in general in this idea of promoting bicycling. And it's certainly something that I was interested in coming to grad school to look at, or doing a PhD to look at, is looking at European countries where you have either no gender gap, or some places you have higher levels of adult women bicycling than their male counterparts. And is it cultural? Is it just facility? Is it a mix of things? Is it different family roles? Even though, I think in a lot of the Western countries there is, definitely some similarities in the, who's responsible for picking up the kids and the groceries and things like that. And I definitely haven't seen any with the teenagers. And I think that would be a really, really cool next study, because again, not that many studies, and like I said, Kelly had the one in 2003, and I found a few since then, dealing with active travel in particular, but it's very small. So then to carry that out in, say, Europe and Australia, where they have a lot of bicycling research going on, and then long-term in Latin and South America, and seeing how those vary, and then seeing, if you could say, well, the teenagers here have this split in gender, and they have it, say, in Europe, and they don't have the gender gap as adults, what does that mean? Like, what's going on that they're repairing that gap or preventing that gap? Or maybe it's starting way earlier and there's not the gap in the European adolescents. So it's a great next study.
We have a question from the web asking if you asked about involvement in team sports.
Joe, do you know, do we have questions about organized sports?
I don't think there's anything that knows.
Yeah, I don't think so in this study. It's a really good question because in some of the other literature I saw, and a lot of the literature about adolescence and physical activity involves organized sport. And probably no shock to anyone, teens who participate in organized sport tend to be more physically active. I mean, kind of almost by definition because they're doing these. So the teens who aren't in organized sport, their incidental activity isn't making up for the difference in organized sport. But in this study, we did not. And so, we asked some general questions about I can't bike or walk because I don't have time, and I thought we had a carry stuff question. I can't remember, but we don't get too deeply into the question of scheduling. And I know you talked about it in your paper that I've been talking about. Is this question of like the overscheduling of youth? And so, certainly in our country, and I don't know about other countries, but in our country, there's so much pressure to get into the best college, and to do that, you have to have from starting at seems like kindergarten now. You have to have leadership activities, and you have to play an instrument, and you have to play a sport, and you have to volunteer, and all these things. So, and then when you have those things spread out spatially, there's just no way that kids can be biking and walking, between activities. So, I don't think we acted. One thing that I've talked to Dr. Dill about that I'm really interested is, we have this before data, and then we're getting this after data from these same youth, and then maybe doing some focus groups or structured interviews with them so we can really dig into some of these questions that maybe didn't make the cut because the surveys were already, we already asked a lot of questions. And then with some of these results, trying to tease out more than we can just from the survey data. And I think that's, they've already, been participating a lot. They're pretty engaged in the process. We can offer more incentives, and I think that'll be a really good. I forgot who else asked about next steps. Whoever. Sorry. That'll be a really good, easy to do with these teens in particular, because now being able to track them over time.
I think one point about organized sports or just organized activities in general. It seems to be more of a trend, and there's some stuff from the American Time Use Survey that show that kids are more scheduled and more engaged in these structured, spatially and temporally explicit activities. So, you have band practice from 3 to 4, you have soccer practice from 4 to 5. And so there's less engagement in unstructured activities and just play. And so it would be interesting to see how that feeds into these ideas of parental rules, because if everything is structured and supervised, then their leniency about letting kids bike could actually be less. So even though the kids might be more engaged in physical activity or like it more, there's sort of this idea that everything you do has to be some organized, scheduled, adult supervised activity. So it could actually have a negative impact on both kids and parents' willingness to do things like bike.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and you guys maybe have all heard of Last Child in the Woods, but kind of this idea.
It sounds like a movie. That's terrible.
That's the name of the book, right? It sounds like a horror movie. You're right now that you say that. But this idea of no more free-range kids. I used to be able, and I don't know if this is still true. When I used to be able to give a talk, I could ask everyone to raise their hand if they biked or walked to school. Well, we might as well. We've got time. Let's try that. How many people biked or walked to school? Let's not say high school. Let's talk about grade school. Okay, so it used to be that almost everyone in the room, but that's still more than half. How many kids, or how many people in this room have kids, nieces and nephews, young cousins, maybe their next door neighbors, young kids that now bike and walk to elementary school? Yeah, okay, so that's pretty typical. So that's really changed. And I think too, one thing that I've never asked is, and I have no idea how this will turn out because I've never done this. How many people in here, when they were a kid, would get turned loose and say, be back by dark? or stay within yelling distance of the house? Right. Okay. Again, your kids, your nieces and nephews, maybe your next door neighbor, how often do you see them turned loose and say, be back by dark? Exactly. Right. Okay. So I'm guessing that's about probably your own kids, right? Yeah. So again, I mean, a big difference, right? So this question of, and the child development literature that I've seen, again, this is not my field of expertise, but is that, those unstructured times are so important for child development and learning how to work out conflict and, kind of learning all these life skills that are really important. So it's kind of, this plays into all of this.
Oh, I was just going to go back to sort of your discussion asking about our experiences and something else you touched on. And I know that I went to Clackamas High School, which is a suburb here of Portland, and our high school is off of Highway 224. I mean, there's no way you could access it by anything but a car,
Right.
literally on the highway. So I didn't own a bike until I moved to Washington, D.C. And even at age 30 right now, and this gets back to exploring the sort of expectations of parents for their daughters versus sons. I mean, like, I'm constantly, it's like my bicycling as a transportation is like a personal affront to my mother because, it scares her.
Right.
And, my grandmother, and why do you do this to me, And so I'm curious if part of the drop-off, I guess, between 12 and 16, so when you're 12, maybe you're biking around your neighborhood, and there's that, but when you're 16, maybe you're starting to use it for commuting, and you're more out in traffic, and you're interacting with other vehicles, and so I'm curious if that's where sort of that like parental relationship starts to kick in, that they become much more worried about their 16-year-old daughters versus their 12-year-old because of where they're traveling.
Yeah,
and sort of the differences between them and sons.
So that's a great question. So we do have in the parental rules and barriers questions, we have things like, and I think with the kids, we say something like, I don't want this kid out, or I have a rule about you can't go out in the street, you can't bike in the street, or you can't, there's like things about the traffic that'll get at that. And I haven't looked at that. But I think what you're saying about, and it'll be more rigorous, is to then look at the actual objective data by age of girls and see, because then we'll be able to tell, like, well, the GPS will tell us. Are they just hanging out in the neighborhood? Are they staying within 3 blocks of the house? Are they going, we'll be able to look at their trip distances. I think that'll be really interesting. One thing that came up during Joe's talk was the question of the rule maker in the house. And one thing that we were speculating, and again, I don't think he'd looked at it, is that quite often the mother is the rule maker. So Joe found that it was the most, I guess, the attitudes or the restrictions of like the more restrictive parent, I don't know if I'm not phrasing that quite right, made the rules. And we were wondering if that was a proxy for it being the mother making the rules. So then you talk about this kind of self-perpetuating cycle where if you have women who, for various reasons, have started to have this gap in like what's okay to go out and do, then are they then perpetuating that on their own daughters? So saying like, they internalize that idea that it's not as safe for girls, and they start having different rules for girls and boys, and then they do that to their own daughters, and then it kind of continues. So it's kind of interesting. That's a long-term question, but
the same thing happened with my mom. So I had a bike and was fine to ride it around, but I was actually grounded as a teenager for riding my bike 10 miles on the hard road. So, you hear that, Mom?
So did you look at correlation between walk score and density and whether or not people thought it was cool to bike or walk, or was it a practical thing to do?
So I feel like I haven't looked at anything at all these questions I'm answering. This was just the very first cut, the exploratory stuff. But no, I have not looked at, and I don't know if anyone on the team has yet looked at, the objective measures, not only just kind of like the general objective measures, but things like putting them in something like bike score and walk score and looking at those scores and doing those attitudes. And I don't know if you can speak to that, but that will be something we'll definitely, especially with the growing interest and the marketing value of things like walk score and bike score, and how they're being used and how that plays in. But we will be able to say, and not from this research, but those things that play into that, that's one of the big questions is how does your neighborhood characteristics influence these kind of attitudes, as much as we can say about that. And then if we tweak those with like a neighborhood greenway, is that enough? Or
even in places like Copenhagen, the city center sees way higher walking and cycling rates than you'll have out in the burbs.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. And that's, I mean, that will be one of the things we'll be looking at is the greenway enough, or is it, you know, and maybe it's enough in certain types of neighborhoods and maybe it's not in others. You know, so like you're saying, like if, or I'm assuming you're alluding to, if the densities are such that it's not going to encourage these things, then putting in a neighborhood greenway to get you places might not be enough to change that behavior. Yeah.
You're sort of soliciting like future research questions, and something
Sure.
That I thought would be like sort of interesting would be to ask like gendered questions. I don't know if this would be sort of like leading questions in a survey sense, but you could ask things, you know, like to the girls, like, oh, well, girls don't ride bikes, or like sort of perception questions about gender, and
Yeah.
see like what sort of correlations those have with like their attitudes. I don't know. That
Yeah.
would be like, and that would sort of play into parental things too, because I think like for some parents, like my parents did that, like girls like do certain things and like
Right.
boys don't do certain things, and so I don't know, that would be interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I mean, one of the, and that's kind of something that I think would be really important to explore in focus groups moving forward, or better yet, even in the one-on-one, if we do it one-on-one interviews, is these, you know, really kind of teasing out the gender norm type questions. One of the things that I am going to do next is do some factor analysis and try and see where I might be able to find, so obviously right now it's just a dichotomy. We're talking boys and girls, you know, so it's kind of just two options, but maybe seeing if we can classify them within that to some of these, like, you know, high active, low embarrassment girls versus the, you know, lower active, higher embarrassment, and kind of looking at the way there might be different, within the girls and boys, different types, and then whether those still affect their attitudes and behaviors. So whether even girls that are, you know, on some measures highly active and, you know, for whatever, and like exercise, are still not traveling as much, and then looking at what's playing into that. So yeah, it's a great question, and that is a definite next step. So I think I keep worrying. I have a couple friends watching. I keep worrying for that question. That's just going to be the hassling.
Any other non-hassling questions? Great. Well, thanks for the great discussion. I think it's really thought-provoking and interesting connections between attitudes. And, you know, one of the big reasons why we're interested in what kids do is how do those attitudes and behaviors carry on as they become adults? And is this like a critical time for us to think about these interventions? So, great work.
Oh, thank you.
So thanks, Tara.
Thank you.
Next week, we're going to hear from another urban studies and planning student, Tessa Walker, who's going to talk about her thesis work on skateboarding. So another strong tie to youth and alternative transportation. So have a good weekend.